The flames consumed everything, the only home she'd ever known, the faces of the few who'd cared, the future she thought she had. 18-year-old Lillian Emerson stood in the ash-choked darkness, watching the Montana orphanage collapse into hell itself. No family, no money, no past worth claiming, just the clothes on her back and a hunger that gnawed deeper than her empty stomach. She had two choices: lie down and die, or walk until something changed. She chose to walk. What happened next would test every ounce of strength she didn't know she had. Stay with me until the end. Drop a like and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly before her, a desolate canvas of sagebrush and stone beneath a sky so vast it seemed to mock her insignificance. Lillian's boots, worn thin at the soles, borrowed from a girl who hadn't made it out, scraped against the hardpan road with each agonizing step. 3 days since the fire. 3 days since she'd eaten anything more than wild berries that left her stomach cramping and uncertain. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant water, teasing her with promises of relief that never materialized. Her dress, once a faded blue calico, now bore the stains of smoke and desperation, dark smudges across the bodice, tears in the hem where thorns had caught and ripped. She'd tried to wash her face in a creek that morning, scrubbing away the soot that had settled into every pore, but the mirror of the water had shown her a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, with lips cracked and bleeding from the relentless sun. Silver Creek rose from the prairie like a mirage made real. A collection of weathered buildings clustered along a muddy main street, false-fronted stores leaning against one another as if for support. Lillian's heart quickened despite her exhaustion. A town meant people. People meant work. Work meant survival. She pushed through the door of the general store first, the bell above jangling cheerfully, a sound grotesquely mismatched to her circumstance. The proprietor, a thick-set man with mutton-chop whiskers and suspicious eyes, looked up from his ledger. "Help you?" His tone suggested he'd already decided the answer was no. "I'm looking for work, sir." Lillian straightened her spine, trying to project a competence her appearance thoroughly contradicted. "I can clean, cook, mend, anything you need." The man's eyes traveled from her tangled dark hair to her ruined boots, cataloging every deficit. "Don't need help. Try the hotel." The hotel proprietress, a sharp-featured woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Caldwell, was even less encouraging. "I run a respectable establishment," she said, her nose wrinkling as if Lillian carried the stench of the fire still. "I can't have someone looking like that, greeting my guests." "I could work in the kitchen," Lillian pressed, hating the desperation that crept into her voice. "You wouldn't need to see me. I have all the help I require." Mrs. Caldwell's hand was already on the door, ushering Lillian back toward the street. "Perhaps try one of the ranches outside town. They're less particular." The saloon keeper laughed in her face. The seamstress took one look and closed the door without a word. At the boarding house, an elderly woman at least had the decency to look sorry as she shook her head. "Times are hard, dear. I can barely feed myself." By late afternoon, Lillian found herself on the outskirts of town, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains with a dread that tasted like iron on her tongue. She'd passed beyond the last of the proper buildings into an area where the structures grew more ramshackle, where chickens scratched in the dirt and a skinny dog barked half-heartedly from beneath a porch. "You lost, girl?" The voice came from behind her, male, rough with years and whiskey. Lillian turned to find two men emerging from what looked like a makeshift bunkhouse, both wearing the kind of stained clothes and predatory expressions that made her skin crawl. "Just passing through," she said, already backing away. "Don't look like you're passing anywhere." The taller one grinned, revealing gaps in his teeth. "Look like you're about to fall over. When's the last time you ate?" "I'm fine." Lillian's hand found the small knife she kept in her pocket. A pitiful defense, but all she had. "We got food inside." The second man jerked his thumb toward the bunkhouse. "Real food. Hot stew. All you gotta do is—" "No." Lillian turned and walked away quickly, her heart hammering. Behind her she heard laughter, cruel and knowing. "Your loss, sweetheart. But you'll be back. They always come back." She walked faster, not caring where she was headed as long as it was away. The road curved northward, climbing slightly as it left Silver Creek behind. Her vision swam. When had she last had water? This morning? Yesterday? The sun was a weight on her shoulders, pressing her toward the earth. Just a little farther, she told herself. Someone will help. Someone has to help. But as the miles stretched on and the landscape grew wilder, emptier, that hope began to feel like a lie she was telling herself to keep moving. The sensible thing would be to turn back, to accept whatever shelter the town might offer, even if it came with conditions that made her stomach turn. The sensible thing would be to compromise, to survive by whatever means necessary. But Lillian had never been particularly sensible. It was a trait the orphanage matrons had noted with disapproval, her stubborn insistence on dignity, on choosing the hard road rather than the easy degradation. It had earned her extra chores, sharper rebukes, longer nights without supper. And it had kept her alive in ways that mattered more than mere breathing. She would not trade herself for a meal. She would not become the kind of broken thing that haunted the edges of frontier towns, used up and discarded. If death was the alternative, then at least she'd die on her own terms. The road ahead shimmered in the heat, and for a moment Lillian thought she was hallucinating, a fork in the path, one branch continuing north into the wilderness, the other veering west toward what looked like smoke? No, not smoke. Dust. The kind raised by livestock. A ranch. Her last chance. The path westward was little more than wagon ruts carved through wild grass, but Lillian followed it with renewed determination. The sun was touching the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful if she'd had the luxury of appreciating beauty. Instead, she focused on putting one foot in front of the other on the curl of dust in the distance that suggested human habitation. The ranch revealed itself gradually, first a fence line, then a barn, then a house that looked solid and well-maintained despite its humble size. Cattle grazed in the near pasture, their hides gleaming red in the dying light. A chicken coop. A vegetable garden gone slightly wild but still producing. Signs of life. Signs of prosperity, or at least sufficiency. Lillian stopped at the edge of the yard, suddenly uncertain. What if they turned her away like everyone else? What if this last hope proved as hollow as all the others? From inside the barn came the sound of hammering, steady and rhythmic. Someone was working, too absorbed to have noticed her approach. Lillian made herself walk forward, across the hard-packed dirt of the yard, toward the open barn door. "Hello?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, barely audible over the hammering. The sound stopped. Footsteps, and then a man emerged from the barn's shadowed interior, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was tall and broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes that assessed her with a directness that wasn't unkind but wasn't soft either. The kind of eyes that had seen hardship and learned to measure risk. "Can I help you?" he asked. Lillian opened her mouth, and to her absolute horror, found she couldn't speak. 3 days of fear and hunger and rejection crashed over her all at once, and the carefully maintained wall of her composure simply crumbled. She swayed on her feet, catching herself against a fence post. "I'm sorry. I'm looking for work. Any work. I can cook and clean, and I'm strong. I promise. I'm stronger than I look. I just need—" "When did you last eat?" The man's voice had changed, gone from wary to concerned. Lillian tried to calculate, but her thoughts moved like molasses. "Yesterday? The day before?" Jesus. The man moved forward, his hand hovering near her elbow as if afraid she might collapse. "Come inside. We'll sort out the work situation after you've had a meal." "I don't want charity." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "I want to work. I can start now. You can start by not passing out in my yard." There was a firmness in his tone that brooked no argument. "I'm Wade Vance. This is my ranch. And you look like you're about 2 minutes from meeting your maker, so let's get some food in you before we discuss employment terms." He turned and walked toward the house, clearly expecting her to follow. Lillian hesitated only a moment before her survival instinct overrode her pride. She trailed after him, her legs shaking with each step. The house was modest but clean, A main room that served as kitchen and living area, with doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. A fire burned in the stone hearth despite the summer heat, and something in a pot above it smelled so good that Lillian's stomach twisted painfully. "Sit." Wade pointed to a chair at a rough-hewn table. "Don't move." He ladled stew into a bowl, thick with chunks of meat and vegetables, the broth glossy with fat, and set it before her with a hunk of bread and a cup of water. Lillian stared at it for a moment, hardly believing it was real, before her body took over. She ate like an animal, barely pausing to breathe, tearing the bread with her teeth and washing it down with gulps of water. Wade watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. When she finally slowed, some of the desperate edge worn off her hunger, he spoke. "There's more if you want it." Lillian shook her head, afraid that eating too much too fast would make her sick. "Thank you. Thank you." "You got a name?" "Lillian. Lillian Emerson." "Where are you from, Lillian Emerson?" "East, an orphanage outside of Billings." She saw no point in lying. "It burned 3 days ago. Most everyone?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Wade's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry." "I don't want pity," Lillian said again, more steadily this time. "I want work. I meant what I said. I can cook, I can clean, I can help with the animals if you teach me. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Why didn't you stay in Silver Creek? Town usually has opportunities for a girl willing to work." The careful phrasing told her he knew exactly what kind of opportunities she would have found. Lillian met his eyes steadily. "Not the kind I'm willing to take." Something shifted in Wade's expression, a flicker of respect or perhaps recognition. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, studying her face with that same assessing directness. "I'll be straight with you," he said. "I've been managing alone since my wife passed 2 years back. It's been difficult. My boy, Thomas, he's 7, and he needs more attention than I can give him while running this place. The house is a disaster. I can barely cook beyond basic stew, and I'm drowning in mending and cleaning that never gets done." Hope kindled in Lillian's chest, bright and painful. "But," Wade continued, his voice careful, "having a young unmarried woman living here, it's going to cause talk. Silver Creek's not exactly progressive in its thinking. People will assume things." "Let them assume." Lillian leaned forward, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "I need this, Mr. Vance. I need it more than I need a spotless reputation. And respectfully, you need help. We can be professional. I'll work hard. I'll stay out of your way except when I'm doing my job. Just, please, give me a chance." Wade was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. Then he sighed, and Lillian could see the decision settle over him. "Trial period," he said. 2 weeks. You'll have the small room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's private, and it's got a decent bed. I'll pay you wages, same as I'd pay any hired help. You take care of the house, the cooking, and help with Thomas. If it works out, we'll make it permanent. If it doesn't, if you decide it's too hard, or if I decide it's not working, you get 2 weeks' pay, and I'll give you a reference for another position." "Thank you." Lillian's voice cracked despite her best efforts. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. You won't regret this." "We'll see." Wade stood, pushing back from the table. "For now, get some rest. You look half dead. Your room's through there." He gestured to a door near the kitchen area. "There's water for washing, and I'll find you something cleaner to wear tomorrow. We'll sort out the details in the morning." The room was small, barely large enough for the narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. But to Lillian, it looked like paradise. Clean sheets, 4 walls, a door that closed, privacy and safety, and the promise of more than just surviving to the next day. She washed her face and hands in the basin, the water turning gray with accumulated grime, then collapsed onto the bed, still fully clothed. The mattress was stuffed with straw and corn husks, nowhere near as fine as the bed she'd occasionally glimpsed in wealthy homes. But after 3 nights on the ground, it felt like a cloud. Sleep pulled at her, heavy and irresistible. But before it claimed her completely, one final thought surfaced. I made it. Against everything, I made it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties. But tonight, she was safe. Tonight, she was fed. Tonight, She had a future that extended beyond the next desperate hour. It was enough. What? Morning arrived with the sound of a child's laughter and the smell of coffee brewing. Lillian woke disoriented, her body aching in new places, the kind of pain that came from finally relaxing after days of tension. Sunlight streamed through the small window, painting stripes across the wooden floor. She sat up slowly, taking stock. Her dress was hopelessly ruined, wrinkled and stained beyond redemption. Her hair felt like a bird's nest. She probably looked worse than she had yesterday, if that was possible. A knock on the door made her jump. "Miss Emerson?" Wade's voice, carefully neutral. "I left some clothes outside the door. They were my wife's. She was about your size, and there's hot water if you want to wash up properly before breakfast." "Thank you," Lillian called, waiting until she heard his footsteps retreat before opening the door. The clothes were neatly folded, a simple brown skirt and cream-colored blouse, both practical and well-made. Beneath them, undergarments and a pair of sturdy boots that looked barely worn. Wade's wife must have been a fortunate woman to have such things. And now she was dead, and Lillian was wearing her clothes. The thought made her uncomfortable, but practicality won out over sentiment. She couldn't work in rags. The hot water was a luxury that made her want to weep. She scrubbed every inch of skin, washing away the smoke and dirt and fear until she felt almost human again. Her hair took longer, the tangles so snarled that she had to work them out strand by strand, her fingers aching by the time she finished. But when she finally dressed and looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw someone different from the desperate creature who'd stumbled into the yard yesterday. Not transformed exactly. Her face was still too thin, her eyes still shadowed with exhaustion, but presentable, capable. Someone who might actually deserve the chance she'd been given. The main room was empty when she emerged, but voices drifted in from outside. Wade's deeper tones and a higher, younger voice chattering excitedly. Lillian followed the sound to find them in the yard, Wade showing a small boy how to properly saddle a horse. "No, Thomas, the cinch goes under his belly, remember? You've got to check it twice or he'll bloat on you and the saddle will slip." The boy, Thomas, Wade's son, was a miniature version of his father, all dark curls and serious eyes. He struggled with the leather strap, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Let me help," Lillian said, stepping forward before she could second-guess herself. Both turned to look at her. Wade's expression was carefully blank, but Thomas's face lit up with uncomplicated curiosity. "Who's that, Papa?" "This is Miss Emerson," Wade said. "She's going to be helping around the house for a while. Lillian, this is my son, Thomas." "Hello, Thomas." Lillian crouched down to the boy's level, offering a smile. "That's a beautiful horse." "His name is Copper," Thomas said proudly. "'Cause he's the color of a penny. Papa gave him to me for my birthday." "Well, Copper is very lucky to have someone who takes such good care of him." She straightened, turning to Wade. "What would you like me to start with today?" Wade secured the saddle with quick, practiced movements before answering. "Kitchen needs cleaning. I'm not much for washing dishes. And if you could do something about the mending pile, I'd be grateful. It's gotten out of hand." "Of course." Lillian hesitated, then asked, "What about meals? What time do you typically eat?" "Breakfast at sunrise, dinner at noon, supper after the work's done, usually around 7. Nothing fancy, just food that sticks to your ribs." "I can do that." And she did. That first day set the pattern for the ones that followed, a routine that was both exhausting and oddly comforting in its predictability. Lillian rose before dawn to start the stove, preparing hearty breakfasts of eggs and bacon and biscuits that made Thomas's eyes go wide. While Wade worked the ranch, she tackled the accumulated neglect of 2 years, scrubbing floors, beating rugs, washing windows until they gleamed. The mending pile was truly impressive, shirts with missing buttons, trousers with torn knees, socks worn through at the heel. She worked through it methodically, her needle flashing in the lamplight, while Thomas did his lessons at the table and Wade attended to paperwork. In the evenings, after supper was cleared and Thomas was in bed, Wade sometimes sat in his chair by the fire, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not unfriendly, but guarded. As if he was waiting for her to prove herself, or prove him wrong for taking the risk. Lillian didn't blame him. She was an unknown quantity, a stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere with nothing to recommend her but desperation. Trust would have to be earned, so she worked. She scrubbed and cooked and mended until her hands were raw and her back ached. She helped Thomas with his reading, gently correcting his pronunciation and praising his progress. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, when Wade needed coffee brought to the barn, which chores couldn't wait and which could be postponed, how to read the weather by the way the cattle moved in the pasture. By the end of the first week, she'd transformed the house. The floors gleamed, the windows sparkled. The kitchen was organized and the larder restocked with preserves she'd made from the wild plums growing along the creek. Wade came in from the barn one evening and stopped short, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. It looks... He trailed off, something complicated crossing his face. It looks like it used to, before. Before his wife died, before everything fell apart. The words hung unspoken between them. I hope that's all right, Lillian said carefully. Wade cleared his throat, turning away. It's fine. It's good. You've done good work. It wasn't effusive praise, but coming from a man as taciturn as Wade Vance, it felt like a benediction. That night, after Thomas was asleep and the dishes were washed, Wade brought out a bottle and 2 glasses. Whiskey, he said, pouring. To celebrate the end of your first week. Lillian accepted the glass hesitantly. She'd never had whiskey before. The orphanage had been strictly temperance. The first sip burned her throat, making her cough, but Wade just smiled slightly and raised his own glass. To second chances, he said. To second chances, Lillian echoed. They drank in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the Montana night was vast and star-filled, the kind of darkness that seemed to stretch forever. But inside this small house, with its warm light and solid walls, Lillian felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like she belonged. The feeling wouldn't last. She knew that. Life had taught her that security was always temporary, always contingent on forces beyond her control. But for this moment, in this place, she let herself believe in the possibility of more, the possibility of a future, the possibility of home. Miss Emerson, Wade said, breaking the silence. His voice was careful, as if he was choosing his words with unusual deliberation. I want you to know what you've done here this past week. It's more than I expected, more than I had any right to ask for. You gave me a chance when no one else would, Lillian replied quietly. I owe you everything. You don't owe me anything. You've earned your place here. He paused, studying the amber liquid in his glass. I'd like to make it permanent, if you're willing. Not just a trial anymore, a real position with fair wages and security. Relief flooded through her, so intense it was almost painful. Yes, I'd like that very much. Wade nodded, satisfied. Good. Then it's settled. He drained his glass and stood. I'll let you get some rest. Tomorrow we've got to check the fence line in the north pasture. Some of the posts are rotting through. I'll need to be out all day. I'll pack you a lunch, Lillian said automatically. Wade paused at the door to his room, looking back at her with an expression that was almost tender. But it was gone before she could be sure, replaced by his usual careful neutrality. Good night, Miss Emerson. Good night, Mr. Vance. Alone in the firelight, Lillian finished her whiskey slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through her chest. 1 week. 1 week since she'd stumbled into this yard half dead from hunger and despair. 1 week since Wade Vance had taken a chance on a ragged stranger with nothing to offer but a willingness to work. How much could change in a single week? How much more might change in the weeks and months to come? But those were thoughts for tomorrow. Tonight she let herself simply be grateful for this room, for this work, for this unexpected kindness that had saved her life. She banked the fire and retired to her small bedroom, where the clean sheets and soft pillow waited. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard Wade moving in his own room, the creak of floorboards and the soft thud of boots being removed. 2 lost souls, she thought drowsily, 2 people trying to survive the wreckage of their pasts. Maybe, together, they could build something new. Maybe. The months that followed settled into a rhythm as reliable as the changing seasons. Lillian rose each morning before the sun touched the eastern peaks, her hands moving through familiar tasks with increasing confidence. The kitchen became her domain, a place where she experimented with recipes gleaned from a worn cookbook she'd found in the cupboard, where she learned to make bread that rose properly and pies with crusts that flaked just right. Thomas became her shadow on days when Wade worked far from the house, chattering endlessly about horses and cowboys and the adventures he planned to have when he grew up. "Miss Lillian, do you think Papa will teach me to rope this year?" he asked one morning, perched on a stool while she kneaded dough. "I think if you keep practicing your chores without being reminded, he just might," Lillian replied, dusting flour from her hands. "Your father values responsibility above everything else. He says that about you." Thomas swung his legs, banging his heels against the stool. "He told Mr. Henderson at the feed store that you're the most responsible person he's ever hired." Warmth bloomed in Lillian's chest, though she kept her expression neutral. "Did he now?" "Yep. Mr. Henderson asked if you were his new wife, and Papa got real quiet and said no, you were his employee, and Mr. Henderson should mind his business." The warmth curdled slightly. Of course people were talking. She'd known they would. A young woman living under the same roof as a widower, no matter how proper the arrangement, it was the kind of thing that kept Silver Creek's gossips busy for months. "Your father's right," Lillian said firmly. "I work here, Thomas. That's all." But even as she said it, she knew the situation was more complicated than that simple declaration suggested. The easy companionship that had developed between her and Wade, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen without needing words, the moments when their eyes met across the dinner table and understanding passed between them, these things felt like more than employer and employee. They felt like partnership. It was dangerous territory, and Lillian tried hard not to let her thoughts wander there. Wade had made his position clear through his careful distance, the way he never lingered in conversation longer than necessary, how he always referred to her as Miss Emerson, even after months of daily proximity. He was still mourning his wife, still carrying that grief like a weight he couldn't put down. And Lillian? She was still the orphan girl he'd taken in out of kindness. To imagine anything more was to invite heartbreak, but the heart, she was discovering, didn't much care about logic. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. The first snow fell in mid-October, blanketing the ranch in white silence. Wade worked longer hours, moving the cattle closer to the barn, reinforcing structures against the coming cold. He came in each evening exhausted, his hands chapped and raw despite the gloves Lillian had mended for him. "It's going to be a hard season," he said one night, warming himself by the fire while she served supper. "Old-timers in town are saying it might be the worst in 20 years. "We're prepared," Lillian said with more confidence than she felt. "The larder's full, the woodpiles stacked high, and the barn secure." Wade smiled slightly, a rare expression that transformed his usually stern face. "You sound like a rancher's wife." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unintended implication. Wade's smile faded, replaced by something uncertain, almost pained. He turned his attention to his plate, and Lillian busied herself with serving Thomas, neither acknowledging what had just passed between them. But she thought about it later, lying in her narrow bed while wind howled around the eaves. A rancher's wife. What would that even mean? Marriage to a man who still wore his wedding ring, who kept his late wife's things in a trunk he thought Lillian didn't know about, who sometimes stood at the window staring at nothing with such profound sadness that it hurt to witness. She had no business wanting things she couldn't have, no business letting her feelings grow beyond gratitude and professional regard. But alone in the darkness, she could admit the truth. Somewhere between scrubbing floors and cooking meals and caring for Thomas, she'd fallen in love with Wade Vance. It was a quiet kind of love, built on small moments rather than grand gestures. The way he always thanked her for meals, even after months of the same routine. How he'd started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table in summer, never saying where they came from, but she knew. The protective way he'd stepped between her and a drunk cowhand in town who'd made an inappropriate comment, his voice going cold and dangerous until the man backed away with muttered apologies. She loved his steadiness, his quiet competence, the way he was teaching Thomas to be a good man through example rather than lectures. She loved the rare moments when he laughed, a sound so unexpected and genuine it made her want to do anything to hear it again. But love unreturned was a burden she'd have to bear alone. Wade had given her security and safety and a place to belong. She wouldn't jeopardize that by admitting feelings he couldn't reciprocate. The snow fell harder as November arrived, drifts piling against the barn until Wade had to shovel a path twice daily just to reach the animals. Lillian kept the house warm and the meals hot, creating an oasis of comfort against the brutal cold outside. Thomas caught a fever that had her sitting up 3 nights in a row, bathing his forehead with cool cloths and spooning broth into him until the sickness broke. Wade found her asleep in the chair beside Thomas's bed on the 3rd morning, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, dark circles under her eyes. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching, before gently shaking her awake. "He's better," Wade said quietly. "Fever's gone. You should get some proper rest." Lillian blinked, disoriented, before the relief hit her. "Thank goodness. I was so worried. I know." Wade's hand was still on her shoulder, warm through the thin fabric of her dress. "You've been taking care of him like he was your own." "He feels like my own," Lillian admitted before she could stop herself. Something shifted in Wade's expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. His hand tightened briefly on her shoulder before he pulled away, stepping back as if he'd crossed an invisible line. "Get some sleep, Miss Emerson. I'll watch him." Lillian retreated to her room, her shoulder still warm where his hand had rested, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. By mid-November, the tension in Silver Creek had grown thick enough to cut. The Blackwood Gang, a group of outlaws who'd been terrorizing settlements across the territory, had moved their operations closer, hitting a ranch 10 miles south and making off with horses and supplies. The territorial marshal was supposedly tracking them, but everyone knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. Wade rode into town for supplies and came back grim-faced, a rifle she'd never seen before propped against his saddle. "Things are getting bad," he said, carrying the rifle inside and setting it above the mantel. "Blackwood hit the Morrison place last night. Beat John Morrison so badly he's laid up, took everything that wasn't nailed down." Fear knotted in Lillian's stomach. "Do you think they'll come here?" "I think we need to be prepared in case they do." Wade pulled out a box of ammunition, his movements deliberate. "Which means you need to learn to shoot." "Me?" Lillian stared at him. "You're here alone with Thomas sometimes when I'm working the far pastures. I need to know you can defend yourself and my son if it comes to that." His eyes met hers, serious and unwavering. "I won't have what happened to the Morrisons happen here." So the lessons began. Each afternoon after the chores were done and Thomas was occupied with his studies, Wade took Lillian out behind the barn and taught her to handle a rifle. The first time she fired it, the recoil knocked her back a step and the noise made her ears ring, but Wade was patient, adjusting her stance and showing her how to brace properly. "Don't jerk the trigger," he said, standing close behind her, his hands guiding hers. "Squeeze it smooth. Breathe out as you fire." Lillian tried to concentrate on his instructions rather than his proximity, the warmth of his body at her back, the way his voice rumbled low near her ear. She fired again, and this time the tin can 20 yards away jumped and clattered to the ground. "Good," Wade said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Again. They practiced until her shoulder ached from the recoil and her hands smelled of gunpowder. Wade was a good teacher, demanding but never harsh, quick to praise improvement and patient with mistakes. By the end of the week, Lillian could hit targets with reasonable accuracy, and by the end of the 2nd week, Wade deemed her competent enough to defend the house if necessary. "I hope you never have to use this in earnest," he said, watching her clean the rifle with careful attention to detail. "But I'm glad you know how." "Me too," Lillian said quietly. Then, because the fear had been gnawing at her, "Wade, what if they come when you're here? What if there are too many of them?" It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both noticed. Wade's expression softened slightly, some of the careful distance he maintained slipping. "Then we fight," he said simply. "We protect what's ours." "What's ours?" The words resonated in Lillian's chest, warm and dangerous. This ranch, this life, this fragile thing they'd built together, when had it become theirs instead of his? December brought more snow and colder temperatures, but also a brief respite from the gang's activities. Travelers reported that Blackwood and his men had moved north, chasing easier targets. The tension in town eased slightly, though Wade kept the rifle loaded and close. Christmas approached, and Lillian found herself wanting to make it special despite their limited resources. She used precious sugar to make candy, fashioned decorations from pine branches and berries, and secretly sewed Thomas a shirt from fabric she'd salvaged and dyed. Wade noticed her preparations but said nothing, though she sometimes caught him watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. On Christmas Eve, after Thomas was asleep with visions of the morning's surprises dancing in his head, Wade poured whiskey for both of them, a ritual that had become their way of marking the end of difficult days. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, snow fell in soft silence. "I got you something," Wade said abruptly, reaching into his pocket. "It's not much, but—" He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Lillian's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it. Inside was a cameo brooch, delicate and beautiful, the profile of a woman carved in creamy white against a dark background. It was the kind of thing that cost real money, the kind of thing a man gave to someone he valued. "Wade, I can't. It's too fine." "It was my mother's," Wade said quietly. "She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to someone worthy of it, someone who'd appreciate what it represented." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "That's you, Lillian. You've brought life back to this house. You've been good to my son. You've been—" He struggled for words. "You've been a blessing I didn't know I needed." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken things heavy between them. Finally, Wade spoke again, his voice low and careful. "My wife, Sarah, she died giving birth to our second child. The baby didn't make it either." The words came slowly, as if each one cost him. "I blamed myself. I should have gotten the doctor sooner, should have known something was wrong, should have—" "Wade, no." Lillian reached across the space between them, covering his hand with hers. "You can't carry that. You can't." "I've been carrying it for 2 years," Wade said. "Carrying the guilt, the grief, the anger at fate for taking them from me. And I told myself that I couldn't—" He stopped, took a breath. "But then you showed up in my yard half dead and desperate, and something in me recognized something in you. Survival, strength, the refusal to give up even when everything's against you." Lillian's heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts over it. "I'm not asking for anything," Wade continued, still not quite meeting her eyes. "I just need you to know that what you've done here, what you've become to me and Thomas, it matters. You matter." "You matter to me too," Lillian whispered, "more than I probably should admit." Wade's hand turned under hers, his fingers lacing with hers, and for a moment they just sat like that, connected across the space that had separated them for months. Then Wade pulled back, standing abruptly and moving to the window, as if he needed distance. "I'm still wearing her ring," he said, staring out at the falling snow. I'm not ready. I don't know if I'll ever be ready." "I'm not asking you to be," Lillian said, though her heart ached with wanting. "I'm just grateful to be here, to have this place, this work, this life. Whatever you can offer, it's enough." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. It wasn't enough. She wanted more, wanted everything, but she'd learned long ago that wanting and having were two very different things. Wade turned from the window, his face shadowed and unreadable. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be busy with Thomas opening his gifts." "Yes." Lillian stood, clutching the cameo brooch. "Good night, Wade." "Good night, Lillian." She lay awake for hours that night, the brooch on the table beside her bed, replaying every word of their conversation. He cared for her, that much was clear. But caring wasn't the same as loving, and loving wasn't the same as being able to let go of the past. She would have to be patient, or she would have to accept that some distances could never be crossed. Christmas morning was chaos in the best possible way. Thomas woke at dawn, bursting with excitement over the shirt Lillian had made him and the wooden horse Wade had carved during long winter evenings. They ate a breakfast of eggs and sweet rolls, and Lillian tried to memorize every detail: Thomas's laughter, the rare smile on Wade's face, the warmth of the fire, and the peace of the moment. This was enough, she told herself. This had to be enough. But January brought a harsh awakening. The Blackwood gang returned with a vengeance, hitting 3 ranches in quick succession. The territorial marshal organized a posse, and Wade volunteered despite Lillian's protests. "I have to," he said, checking his rifle. "If we don't stop them now, they'll bleed us all dry." "Then I'm coming with you," Lillian said. "Absolutely not." "You taught me to shoot for a reason," she argued. "And you said yourself, we protect what's ours." Wade stared at her, conflict warring across his face. Finally, he shook his head. "No, I need you here with Thomas. If something happens to me..." "Don't say that." "If something happens," Wade continued firmly, "the ranch is yours. There's papers in my desk, all legal. You and Thomas will be taken care of." Lillian's throat closed with fear. "Wade!" He pulled her close, sudden and fierce, his arms tight around her. "I'll come back," he murmured into her hair. "I promise I'll come back." Then he was gone, riding out with a dozen other men toward the winter dawn, and Lillian was left to wait and worry and pray to a heaven she wasn't sure was listening. 3 days passed like 3 years. Lillian kept herself busy with chores and caring for Thomas, but her attention was always divided, always listening for hoofbeats that would signal Wade's return. The nights were worst, long dark hours where every creak of the house made her jump, where her imagination conjured terrible scenarios she couldn't banish. On the morning of the 4th day, she was in the kitchen kneading bread when she heard it, riders approaching fast. Her heart leapt into her throat. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the window, relief flooding through her when she recognized Wade's horse. But the relief died when she saw him. He was slumped in the saddle, his left arm hanging useless at his side, blood staining his shirt. 2 other men from the posse flanked him, helping keep him upright. Lillian ran outside, Thomas on her heels. "He took a bullet," one of the men said as they helped Wade down. "We got it out, but he's lost blood. Needs rest and tending." "Get him inside," Lillian commanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Thomas, boil water, lots of it." They maneuvered Wade into his room, laying him on the bed. He was conscious but pale, his breathing shallow. Lillian sent the men away with thanks and set to work, cutting away his blood-soaked shirt to expose the wound in his shoulder. It was angry and red but clean. They'd done good work removing the bullet. She cleaned it with whiskey, ignoring Wade's hissed curses, then packed it with clean cloth and bound it tight. Thomas brought water and clean rags, his face frightened but determined to help. "Did you get them?" Lillian asked as she worked. "Most of them," Wade said through gritted teeth. "Blackwood got away, but the rest are either dead or captured. It's over." "It better be," Lillian said fiercely, "because if you ever scare me like that again, I'll shoot you myself." Wade laughed, actually laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his wound. Noted. She stayed with him through the night, changing his bandages when they seeped blood, bathing his forehead when fever threatened. By morning, the crisis had passed, and Wade slept peacefully while Lillian dozed in the chair beside his bed, too exhausted to make it to her own room. She woke to find him watching her, his dark eyes clear and focused. "You stayed," he said softly. "Of course I stayed." Lillian sat up, stretching her stiff neck. "Where else would I be?" "You could have left," Wade said. "When you thought I might die. Taken what you needed and started over somewhere safer, somewhere that didn't have outlaws and danger." "Is that what you think?" Lillian moved to the edge of the bed, her voice sharp with hurt. "That I'm only here for security? That I'd abandon you and Thomas the moment things got difficult?" "I don't know what to think," Wade admitted. "I don't know how to—" He stopped, frustrated. "Sarah's been gone 2 years, and I thought I'd buried everything with her. But then you came, and you made me feel things I thought were dead. And I'm terrified, Lillian. Terrified of caring that much again, of having that much to lose." Lillian's anger melted into understanding. She reached out, taking his uninjured hand in both of hers. "I'm terrified too. I've never had anything worth losing before, but I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone." Wade's fingers tightened around hers. "I'm still wearing the ring." "I know. I might always wear it in some way. She was my wife. the mother of my child. That doesn't just disappear. I'm not asking it to, Lillian said. I'm not asking you to forget her or stop loving her. I'm just asking. She paused, gathering courage. I'm asking if there might be room for something new, not instead of what you had, but alongside it. Wade was quiet for a long moment, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. Then he tugged her closer, and she went, perching carefully on the edge of the bed. When I was out there bleeding and thinking I might die, Wade said, the only thing I could think about was getting back to you. Not the ranch, not even Thomas at first. You. Your face, your voice, the way you hum while you cook. I realized I'd been lying to myself, pretending I could keep you at arm's length, keep my heart safe. He lifted his hand to her face, cupping her cheek. But it's too late for that. My heart's already yours, whether I meant to give it or not. Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks. Wade, I love you, he said simply. I love your strength and your stubbornness, and the way you've made this house a home again. I love how you care for my son like he's yours. I love... Lillian kissed him, cutting off the words with her lips, pouring everything she felt into that contact. Wade's hand slid into her hair, holding her close despite his injury, kissing her back with a desperation that spoke of months of denial and longing finally released. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Wade rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. Not because it's proper or because people talk. Marry me because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you're already my partner in everything that matters. Because I want to wake up every morning and see your face and know you're mine. Yes, Lillian whispered. Yes, Wade. Yes. They married 3 weeks later in Silver Creek's small church, with Thomas beaming beside them and half the town in attendance. Lillian wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself, and Wade stood tall despite his arm still healing in a sling. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Wade kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The ranch truly became theirs then, not just in practice, but in name. Lillian Vance, rancher's wife, mother to Thomas, partner to the man she loved. It wasn't the life she'd imagined during those desperate days after the fire, but it was better than anything she could have dreamed. The first morning Lillian woke as Wade's wife, sunlight was streaming through the bedroom window in golden shafts, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. She lay still for a moment, absorbing the reality of her new circumstances. Wade's arm was draped across her waist, his breathing deep and even against her shoulder. The ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to Wade's grandmother, caught the light and gleamed. She was married, she was home, she was safe. The thought should have brought pure contentment, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of unease she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was simply too good to be true. Perhaps she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for fate to snatch away this happiness as quickly as it had granted it. Wade stirred beside her, his arm tightening briefly before he woke fully. When his eyes opened and found hers, a slow smile spread across his face, the kind of unguarded expression she rarely saw from him. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning, Mr. Vance," she replied, feeling warmth bloom in her chest at the sound of her new name. A thundering of small feet in the hallway announced Thomas's approach. The boy burst through the door without knocking, launching himself onto the bed with enough force to make them both grunt. "You're married now," Thomas announced, as if they might have forgotten overnight. "Does this mean Miss Lillian is my mama?" Wade and Lillian exchanged glances, and she saw her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. It was one thing to become a wife, another entirely to claim the title of mother to a child who remembered his own. "That's up to you, son," Wade said carefully. "Lillian's your stepmother now, but what you call her, that's your choice." Thomas considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. "Can I think about it?" "Of course," Lillian said, pulling him close and ruffling his dark curls. "Take all the time you need." But the question lingered in the air even after Thomas bounded off to do his morning chores. As Lillian dressed and began preparing breakfast, she found herself wondering about the woman whose place she'd taken. Sarah Vance, the first wife, the beloved dead. Wade had loved her enough to mourn for 2 years, enough that speaking her name still brought pain to his eyes. Could Lillian ever measure up to a ghost? Could she be enough for a man who'd already had everything and lost it? The weeks following the wedding settled into a new rhythm, one that was both familiar and strange. Lillian's responsibilities hadn't changed. She still cooked and cleaned and cared for Thomas. But now she shared Wade's bed, woke to his kisses, felt his hands on her skin in the darkness. It was a kind of intimacy she'd never known, overwhelming in its intensity, terrifying in how much power it gave him to hurt her. But Wade was gentle with her, patient with her inexperience, and gradually the fear gave way to something warmer, deeper. Love, she supposed, though the word felt inadequate for the tangle of emotion she felt when she looked at him. Spring arrived with a fury of wildflowers and renewed energy. The ranch demanded constant attention as calves were born and fences needed mending after winter's assault. Wade worked from dawn until well past dusk, and Lillian found herself taking on more outdoor tasks, learning to tend the animals with competence, if not expertise. She was feeding the chickens one afternoon when a wagon rolled into the yard, driven by a woman Lillian didn't recognize. The visitor was perhaps 40, handsome in a severe way, dressed in expensive fabric that marked her as someone of means. She climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease and approached Lillian with an assessing gaze. "You must be the new Mrs. Vance," the woman said, her tone making it clear she'd heard all the gossip. "I am," Lillian replied, straightening her spine. "Can I help you?" "I'm Margaret Cartwright. I own the ranch bordering yours to the east." The woman's eyes swept over Lillian, taking in her work-roughened hands and simple dress. "I was a friend of Sarah's. I thought I should pay my respects to her replacement." The word landed like a slap. Lillian felt her cheeks flush but kept her voice level. "I'm not replacing anyone, Mrs. Cartwright. I'm simply trying to build a life here." "Of course you are." Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though I must say it's remarkable how quickly you managed to secure your position. Sarah was barely cold in the ground before you arrived, wasn't she?" "Sarah had been dead for 2 years when I came to this ranch," Lillian said, her patience fraying. "And I came looking for honest work, nothing more." "Honest work," Margaret laughed, a brittle sound. "Is that what we're calling it? You were a homeless orphan, and now you're a rancher's wife. You must be very talented at domestic duties." The implication was clear and vicious. Lillian felt anger surge, hot and fierce. But before she could respond, Wade's voice cut across the yard. "That's enough, Margaret." He strode toward them, his expression thunderous. Margaret's confident smile faltered slightly. "Wade, I was just insulting my wife," Wade finished coldly. "I heard you, and I'll thank you to leave my property before I say something we'll both regret." "I was Sarah's friend," Margaret protested, her composure cracking. "Someone needs to defend her memory. You married this girl barely a year after you stopped wearing mourning clothes. What would Sarah think?" Wade's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Sarah would think I deserved happiness. She would think my son deserved a mother who loved him. And she sure as hell wouldn't appreciate you using her memory as an excuse to spread poison." He pointed toward the road. "Get off my land, Margaret, and don't come back." Margaret climbed back into her wagon, her face mottled with anger and humiliation. "The whole county is talking about you," she shot back as she gathered the reins. "They're saying she trapped you, that she used your loneliness to secure herself a comfortable life. They're saying—" "I don't give a damn what they're saying," Wade interrupted. "Now get out." They watched the wagon roll away in tense silence. When it disappeared from view, Lillian released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "I'm sorry," Wade said, turning to her. Margaret's always been bitter. Her husband left her years ago, and she's never forgiven the world for it. "I should have warned you about her." "It doesn't matter what she thinks," Lillian said, though the woman's words had found their mark, awakening all her old insecurities. "I know why I married you." "Do you?" Wade's eyes searched her face. "Because sometimes I wonder if you really understand what you signed up for. The gossip, the judgment, the comparisons to a dead woman you never knew." "I understand that I love you," Lillian said firmly. "Everything else is just noise." But as she returned to her chores, Margaret's accusations echoed in her mind. Trapped him. Used his loneliness, secured a comfortable life. Was there truth in those cruel words? She'd been desperate when she arrived, starving and homeless. Would she have fallen in love with Wade if he'd been poor instead of prosperous? If he'd offered her nothing but hardship instead of security? The questions haunted her through the following days, poisoning her contentment. She found herself watching Wade with new uncertainty, wondering if he harbored similar doubts. Did he ever regret his choice? Did he wake beside her and wish he was waking beside Sarah instead? The crisis came to a head on a Saturday in late April. Lillian was in the kitchen preserving the first strawberries of the season when Thomas came running in, his face alight with excitement. "Mama! Mama, come quick! Papa caught a fox in the chicken coop." Lillian's hand stilled over the pot of boiling fruit. Thomas had called her many things over the months. "Miss Lillian, ma'am," sometimes just Lillian, but never Mama. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. "Did you just—" she started, her voice catching. Thomas seemed to realize what he'd said. His excitement dimmed, replaced by uncertainty. "Is that okay? Can I call you that?" Lillian knelt down, pulling him into a fierce hug. "Yes," she whispered against his hair. "Yes, sweetheart. It's more than okay." When she looked up, Wade was standing in the doorway, covered in dirt and feathers, but smiling with such tenderness that it took her breath away. The doubts that had been plaguing her for days suddenly seemed foolish. This was real. This love, this family they were building, it was real and valid and hers. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't done testing her yet. The letter arrived in early May, delivered by a rider passing through from Billings. It was addressed to Lillian in handwriting she didn't recognize, and when she opened it, her blood ran cold. "Dear Miss Emerson, I am writing to inform you that your uncle, Robert Emerson, has recently learned of your survival. He had believed you perished in the orphanage fire along with the others. He wishes to make contact and discuss your future. As your only living relative, he feels it is his duty to provide for you and ensure you are properly situated. Please respond at your earliest convenience to arrange a meeting. Respectfully, Theodore Walsh, Attorney at Law." Lillian read the letter 3 times, each word sinking in like stones in deep water. An uncle. Family. Someone who'd never bothered to claim her when she was a child, who'd let her languish in an orphanage while he lived his life elsewhere. And now he wanted to discuss her future, as if she were still a child to be managed, rather than a grown woman with a husband and home of her own. "What is it?" Wade asked, noticing her distress. She handed him the letter silently, watching his expression darken as he read. "You never mentioned an uncle," he said carefully. "I didn't know I had one. Or if I did, I'd forgotten." Lillian paced to the window, her mind racing. "My parents died when I was 3. I have no memory of any family beyond that. Why would he surface now after all these years?" Wade set the letter down, his jaw tight. "The question is, what do you want to do about it?" "Ignore it," Lillian said immediately. "I don't need him. I don't want anything from him." But Wade was frowning, that analytical look on his face that meant he was thinking through implications. "If he's your legal guardian, if he has some claim on you—" "I'm married," Lillian interrupted. "That makes you my legal guardian, doesn't it?" "I'm your husband, not your guardian." "But—" Wade paused, clearly uncomfortable. "Lillian, if this man is truly your uncle, he might have grounds to contest our marriage. You were 18 when we wed, barely of age. A good lawyer could argue you were coerced, that you married me out of desperation rather than free will." The words struck like a physical blow. "That's ridiculous. I married you because I love you." "I know that, but a judge might see it differently. A homeless orphan girl taken in by a wealthy rancher, marrying him within a year?" Wade's voice was gentle, but his eyes were worried. "Margaret wasn't wrong about how it looks." "So what are you saying?" Lillian demanded, fear making her sharp. "That we should just let him take me? That our marriage doesn't matter?" "No." Wade crossed to her, gripping her shoulders. "I'm saying we need to be smart about this. Meet with him, find out what he wants, and make it clear that you're exactly where you choose to be." The meeting was arranged for the following week in Silver Creek's only hotel. Lillian dressed with care, choosing her best dress and pinning up her hair in a style that made her look older, more sophisticated. Wade insisted on accompanying her, his presence a solid comfort at her side. Robert Emerson was nothing like she'd imagined. He was a small man, fastidiously dressed with thinning hair and the soft hands of someone who'd never done physical labor. His smile was practiced and didn't reach his eyes. "My dear niece," he said, rising as they entered the hotel's sitting room. "How wonderful to finally meet you. I've been searching for you since I heard about the fire." "Have you?" Lillian sat in the chair across from him, her spine straight. "That's interesting, since you never searched for me in the 17 years before it." Robert's smile tightened. "Your parents and I had a falling out. I'm not proud of abandoning you to that institution, but I was young and foolish. I've regretted it ever since." "What do you want, Mr. Emerson?" Wade asked bluntly. Robert's gaze shifted to him, assessing and dismissive. "I want to provide for my niece, of course, to give her the life she deserves. I own a successful mercantile in Helena. She could work there, learn the business, perhaps make a good marriage to someone suitable." "I am married," Lillian said coldly, "to Mr. Vance here." "Yes, I heard about that." Robert's tone suggested he found the whole thing distasteful. "A hasty decision, made under difficult circumstances. Surely you can see that a young woman in your position, homeless, desperate, might not have been thinking clearly. I'm prepared to help you dissolve this arrangement and start fresh." Wade's hand found Lillian's under the table, squeezing tight. She squeezed back, drawing strength from the contact. "My marriage is not an arrangement to be dissolved," she said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "I married Wade of my own free will, and I have no intention of leaving him." "You were barely more than a child," Robert pressed. "Living under his roof, dependent on him for survival. Can you honestly say there was no coercion involved?" "The only coercion I feel is coming from you right now," Lillian shot back. "You want to know the truth, Mr. Emerson? Wade saved my life. He gave me work when everyone else turned me away. He treated me with respect and dignity when I had nothing. And yes, I fell in love with him, not because I had to, but because he's a good man who deserves to be loved." "A touching story," Robert said dryly. "But sentiment doesn't change the facts. You're my blood relative, and as such, I have certain responsibilities and rights regarding your welfare." "She's 19 years old and legally married," Wade interjected, his voice hard. "What rights do you think you have?" Robert leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "The right to ensure she wasn't taken advantage of. The right to contest a marriage that may have been entered into under duress. I've already consulted with a lawyer, Mr. Vance. The territorial courts take a dim view of wealthy men who prey on vulnerable young women." "Prey on—" Lillian stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "How dare you? Wade has never been anything but honorable. You, on the other hand, left a 3-year-old orphan to rot in an institution for 15 years and now have the gall to pretend you care about my welfare. I know exactly what you want, and it's not me. It's control. It's ownership. Maybe you think there's money to be made, or maybe you just can't stand the idea that I built a life without your permission. Either way, you can go straight to hell." She stormed out of the room, Wade following close behind. They made it to the wagon before her composure cracked, and she leaned against the side panel, shaking with anger and fear. "He's going to try to take me away," she said, her voice breaking. "He's going to use the law to destroy everything we've built." "No, he's not." Wade turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face. "I won't let him. We'll fight this, Lillian. We'll get the best lawyer in the territory if we have to. But you're not going anywhere. You're my wife, and nothing, not him, not the law, not anyone, is going to change that." The legal battle that followed was brutal and humiliating. Robert Emerson filed a petition to have the marriage annulled on grounds that Lillian had been coerced through economic desperation. The case drew attention from across the territory, with newspapers running salacious headlines about the orphan girl and the rancher who'd taken advantage of her. Lillian was forced to testify, to answer invasive questions about her relationship with Wade, about whether she'd felt pressured to accept his proposal, about whether she truly understood what marriage meant. The opposing lawyer painted her as a naive child, helpless and easily manipulated. He painted Wade as a predator who'd exploited her vulnerability for his own satisfaction. Through it all, Wade sat in the courtroom, his face a mask of controlled fury, while Lillian fought to maintain her dignity under the onslaught of accusations and insinuations. The turning point came when Thomas was called to testify. The boy, now 8 years old, stood before the judge with his shoulders back and his chin raised, every inch his father's son. "Do you like Mrs. Vance?" the judge asked gently. "I love her," Thomas said clearly. "She's my mama. She takes care of me when I'm sick, and she helps me with my lessons. And she makes the best apple pie in Montana." "And do you think your father forced her to marry him?" Thomas looked genuinely confused by the question. "No, sir. I asked Papa when they were going to get married because I could tell they loved each other. He said it was up to Miss Lillian, that she had to want it too. And she did want it. I was there when Papa proposed, and she was crying because she was so happy." The courtroom was silent as Thomas climbed down from the witness stand. The judge, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness, looked at Robert Emerson with thinly veiled disgust. "Mr. Emerson," he said, "I've listened to several days of testimony in this case, and I've yet to hear any evidence of actual coercion or undue influence. What I have heard is the story of a young woman who, through no fault of her own, found herself destitute and desperate. And I've heard how Mr. Vance offered her honest employment, treated her with respect, and eventually, after months of propriety, asked her to be his wife." "Your Honor," Robert's lawyer began, but the judge held up a hand. "I'm not finished. I've also heard how Mrs. Vance has embraced her role as wife and mother, how she's contributed to the success of the Vance Ranch, and how she's built a life she's clearly proud of. The fact that she started from nothing doesn't make her helpless or incompetent. It makes her resilient." He looked directly at Lillian. "Mrs. Vance, do you wish to remain married to Wade Vance?" "More than anything, Your Honor," Lillian said, her voice strong and clear. "Then this petition is denied." The judge's gavel came down with a decisive crack. "The marriage stands. Mr. Emerson, I suggest you accept your niece's decision and leave her in peace. Court is adjourned." The relief was so intense that Lillian's legs nearly gave out. Wade caught her, holding her steady while the courtroom erupted in whispers and speculation. Robert Emerson stood frozen, his face twisted with rage, before storming out without a backward glance. "It's over," Wade murmured into Lillian's hair. "It's finally over." But even as she clung to him, Lillian knew that wounds had been opened that would take time to heal. The trial had exposed every insecurity, every doubt, dragging them into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The whole territory had heard Robert's lawyer argue that their love was a lie, that Lillian had traded her body for security, that Wade had exploited a desperate girl for his own pleasure. The accusations weren't true, but that didn't stop them from leaving scars. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Thomas chattered from the back of the wagon, oblivious to the tension, excited about a bird's nest he'd spotted near the courthouse. That night, after Thomas was asleep, Lillian and Wade sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and indifferent to human drama. "Do you ever regret it?" Lillian asked quietly. "Marrying me? All this trouble we've had, the gossip, the trial, people questioning your honor, none of it would have happened if you'd just kept me as an employee." Wade was silent for a long moment, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "You want to know what I regret?" he finally said. "I regret not telling you sooner that I loved you. I regret wasting months keeping you at arm's length because I was too scared to move on from the past. I regret that you had to endure that trial, had to hear those lies about us." He turned to face her, his eyes serious. "But marry you? Be your husband? Have you as my partner in this life? I don't regret that for a single second. Even though people think—" "I don't care what people think," Wade interrupted. "I know the truth. You know the truth. Thomas knows the truth. That's all that matters." Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the last of her fear begin to dissolve. They'd been tested, by circumstance, by malice, by doubt, and they'd survived. Their marriage had been questioned and challenged, dragged through the courts and examined under the harshest possible light, and it had emerged intact, stronger even, for having been tested. "I love you," she said softly. "I loved you when I had nothing, and I'll love you if I have nothing again. You're not my security, Wade. You're my heart." Wade kissed her then, long and deep, with all the passion and tenderness that had been building through weeks of legal battles and restrained emotion. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Let's go to bed, Mrs. Vance," he murmured. "Let's forget about lawyers and judges and bitter old men trying to control things that aren't theirs to control. Let's just be us." And they did. In the sanctuary of their bedroom, in the home they'd built together, they reaffirmed every vow, every promise, every whispered declaration of love. The outside world faded away until there was nothing but skin and breath and the fierce certainty that they belonged to each other, now and always. Later, as Lillian lay in Wade's arms listening to his heartbeat slow into the rhythm of sleep, she allowed herself to truly believe it was over. Robert Emerson had lost. Their marriage had been validated. The future stretched before them, full of possibility and promise. She'd started as an orphan with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope for survival. Now she was a wife, a mother, a partner in building something that would last. The journey had been harder than anything she could have imagined, but the destination was worth every struggle, every fear, every moment of doubt. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And nothing, not gossip, not laws, not bitter relatives, would ever take that away from her again. Summer arrived with a vengeance that year, the kind of heat that shimmered off the prairie in visible waves and made even the hardiest cattle seek shade in the heat of the day. Lillian had grown accustomed to the rhythms of ranch life, but the trial had left invisible marks on both of them, a wariness in Wade's eyes when strangers approached, a tension in Lillian's shoulders when they rode into town for supplies. The gossip hadn't died completely. It had merely transformed, mutating from accusations of impropriety into something more insidious, pity mixed with speculation. Poor Wade Vance, some whispered, trapped in a marriage to a woman who'd maneuvered him into it. Poor Lillian Vance, others countered, stuck with a man who'd only married her to avoid scandal. The truth, that they'd chosen each other freely and loved each other fiercely, seemed too simple for people who thrived on drama. Lillian tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the work that never seemed to end. The garden she'd planted in spring was producing abundantly, and she spent long hours preserving vegetables and fruits for the coming winter. Thomas helped when he wasn't working alongside his father, his small hands surprisingly deft at shelling peas and cutting beans. "Mama," he said one afternoon, the word now coming naturally to his lips, "why do people in town look at us funny sometimes?" Lillian's hands stilled over the pot she was stirring. She'd hoped Thomas had been too young to notice the sideways glances, the conversations that stopped when they approached. Apparently she'd been wrong. "People sometimes talk about things they don't understand," she said carefully, measuring her words. "They see something different from what they're used to, and it makes them uncomfortable. But we're not different. We're just a family." "I know, sweetheart. But some people—" She paused, searching for the right explanation. "Some people think they know better than we do about our own lives. They think because I didn't grow up here, because your papa and I got married quickly, that there must be something wrong with it." Thomas frowned, his young face troubled. "That's stupid." "Thomas," Lillian said automatically, though she couldn't entirely disagree with the sentiment. "Well, it is. Papa loves you. You love Papa. I love both of you. What else matters?" Out of the mouths of children, Lillian thought, came wisdom that adults seemed to have forgotten. "You're absolutely right. Nothing else matters." But that night, alone with Wade after Thomas had gone to bed, she brought up the conversation. "He's noticing things," she said, sitting at the table while Wade reviewed the ranch accounts by lamplight. "The way people treat us in town. He asked me about it today." Wade looked up from his ledger, his expression grim. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That people talk about things they don't understand, but Wade, I hate that he has to deal with this. He's just a child. He shouldn't have to defend his family's honor." "No, he shouldn't." Wade set down his pencil, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "Maybe we should start going to Billings for supplies instead. It's farther, but at least we wouldn't have to deal with Silver Creek's small-minded busybodies." "Running away won't solve anything," Lillian said, though part of her was tempted by the idea. "Besides, this is our home. We have a right to live here without being made to feel ashamed of something we didn't do wrong." Wade reached across the table, taking her hand. "I'm sorry you have to go through this." I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from it. This isn't your fault, and I'm not some fragile thing that needs protecting. Lillian squeezed his hand. I knew what I was getting into when I married you. I just wish... She stopped, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. What do you wish? I wish they could see us the way we really are. Not the story they've invented in their heads, but the truth. Two people who found each other when they both needed finding. Two people who built something real out of desperate circumstances. She laughed, a bitter sound, but I suppose that's not dramatic enough for them. The summer dragged on, each day bleeding into the next in a haze of heat and endless work. The cattle prices were down, and Wade spent long hours poring over the accounts, trying to figure out how to stretch their resources further. Lillian contributed what she could by selling her preserves and baked goods at the general store, but it was barely enough to make a difference. It was during one of these trips to town that the real trouble began. Lillian was loading her wagon with the empty jars from the previous week's sales when she overheard two women talking near the dry goods section. She wouldn't have paid attention except that she heard her own name spoken in a tone that made her spine stiffen. I heard she's already expecting, one woman said in a stage whisper that carried clearly across the store. Convenient, isn't it? Barely a year married and already trying to trap him with a baby. Well, what else would she do? The other replied. She knows her looks won't last forever. Better to secure her position now while she can. Lillian's hands clenched on the jar she was holding, her face burning. She wanted to march over there and set them straight, wanted to defend herself against their vicious speculation. But she also knew that engaging would only make things worse, would give them more ammunition for their gossip. She forced herself to finish loading the wagon with hands that shook slightly, her breath coming quick and shallow. The worst part wasn't even the cruelty of their words, it was the kernel of truth buried within them. She wasn't pregnant, but she and Wade had been trying. She'd hoped secretly that a baby might help heal some of the wounds the trial had left, might give them something pure and untainted to focus on. Now even that hope felt poisoned by implication. Wade found her that evening sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing. He sat beside her without speaking, his presence a solid comfort. Bad day? He asked eventually. I heard some women in town talking about us, about me. Lillian's voice was flat, drained of emotion. They think I'm trying to trap you with a baby. Wade cursed under his breath. People are idiots. Are they? Lillian turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. Wade, be honest with me. Do you ever wonder if they're right? If I did manipulate you somehow, even unconsciously, if I... Stop! Wade's voice was sharp, cutting through her spiral of doubt. Stop letting their poison into your head. You didn't manipulate me. You didn't trap me. I pursued you, remember? I asked you to marry me. You didn't force me into anything. But I was desperate, Lillian insisted, needing him to understand the fear that kept her awake at night. I was starving and homeless, and you offered me security. How do either of us know that my feelings are real? How do I know I'm not just... Wade kissed her, hard and thorough, cutting off her words. When he pulled back, his eyes were blazing. You want to know how I know your feelings are real? He demanded. Because you could have walked away a dozen times, when Robert Emerson offered you a life in Helena, when the trial got ugly, when people started talking. You could have saved yourself all this trouble by leaving. But you stayed. You fought for us. You stood in that courtroom and declared your love in front of everyone, even knowing it would make you a target for more gossip. That doesn't prove... It proves everything, Wade interrupted. A woman who was just looking for security would have taken the easier path. You chose the hard one. You chose me, even when it cost you. That's not manipulation, Lillian. That's love. The words broke something open inside her, and suddenly she was crying, deep, wrenching sobs that she'd been holding back for weeks. Wade pulled her close, letting her weep against his chest while the Montana sky darkened overhead and the first stars began to emerge. I'm so tired of fighting, she whispered when the tears finally subsided. Tired of proving myself, tired of defending our marriage, tired of feeling like I have to earn the right to be here. Then stop, Wade said simply. Stop fighting. Stop trying to prove anything to anyone except yourself. We know the truth. Thomas knows the truth. That has to be enough. And slowly, painfully, Lillian began to accept that he was right. She couldn't control what people thought or said. She could only control her own actions, her own truth. Let them whisper, let them speculate. As long as she and Wade knew what they had was real, nothing else mattered. But fate, it seemed, had one more test in store for them. It happened on a Tuesday in late August. Wade had ridden out at dawn to check on the cattle in the north pasture, planning to be back by midday. When the sun climbed past its zenith and began its descent toward the western peaks without any sign of him, Lillian started to worry. By 3 o'clock, the worry had bloomed into full-fledged fear. "Thomas," she called to the boy, who was practicing his roping on fence posts, "saddle Copper and ride to the Morrison place. Ask if they've seen your father today." Thomas must have heard something in her voice because he didn't argue, just nodded and ran toward the barn. Lillian watched him go, then turned her attention to the horizon, willing Wade's familiar silhouette to appear. Thomas returned an hour later, alone. "Mr. Morrison hasn't seen him, but he said there was smoke coming from the north pasture earlier. He thought Papa was doing controlled burns." Smoke. Fear turned to ice in Lillian's veins. They hadn't planned any burns. If there was smoke, it meant fire, and Wade was out there alone. "Stay here," she commanded Thomas, already moving toward the barn. "Do not leave this house for any reason. Do you understand me?" "But, Mama?" "Thomas." She stopped, turning to grip his shoulders. "I need you to be brave right now. Stay here, keep the rifle loaded, and if anyone comes who isn't me or your father, you know what to do." The boy's face was pale but determined. "Yes, ma'am." Lillian saddled Wade's fastest horse, checking the rifle scabbard and making sure she had ammunition. Then she rode north like the devil himself was chasing her, her heart pounding in time with the horse's hooves. She smelled the smoke before she saw it, acrid and thick, carried on the wind. As she crested a rise, the full scope of the disaster became clear. A section of the north pasture was burning, flames racing through the dry grass with terrifying speed. And there, in the middle of it all, was Wade's horse, riderless and panicked, running in circles. "Wade!" Lillian screamed his name, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. "Wade, where are you?" She rode closer, scanning the smoke and flames desperately. Then she saw him, a dark shape on the ground near the creek bed, not moving. Terror gave her the courage to ride straight into the smoke, her eyes streaming and her lungs burning. She dismounted in a rush, falling to her knees beside Wade's prone form. He was breathing, thank everything that was holy, but there was blood on his temple, and his leg was bent at an unnatural angle. His horse must have spooked and thrown him. "Wade, can you hear me?" She patted his face, trying to rouse him. "Wake up, please wake up." His eyelids fluttered. "Lillian?" His voice was weak, confused. "What? The fire?" "Don't worry about the fire. Can you move? We need to get out of here before the flames reach us." "My leg!" Wade gasped, trying to sit up and falling back with a cry of pain. "Think it's broken." The fire was getting closer, the heat intense even from 50 yards away. Lillian looked around frantically, her mind racing through options. The creek bed offered some protection, but if the fire jumped it, they'd be trapped. She needed to get Wade on a horse and get them both out of here. But there was no way he could ride with that leg, unless she could splint it first. Moving with desperate efficiency, Lillian tore strips from her petticoat, found 2 straight branches near the creek, and bound Wade's leg as tightly as she dared. He gritted his teeth through the process, sweat beading on his forehead, but he didn't cry out. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, positioning herself to haul him upright. "But we have to move. Now." Getting Wade onto the horse was a nightmare of pain and awkward maneuvering. He nearly passed out twice, and Lillian had to use every ounce of strength she possessed to lift him. But finally, he was mounted, swaying dangerously, and she swung up behind him, wrapping one arm around his waist to keep him stable while guiding the horse with the other. They rode through smoke so thick she could barely see the horse's ears, let alone the path ahead. Lillian navigated by instinct and prayer, trusting the horse to find its way while she focused on keeping Wade upright. Behind them, the fire raged on, consuming everything in its path. They broke through the smoke into clear air, and Lillian allowed herself one shuddering breath of relief before urging the horse faster. They needed to get home, needed to get Wade's leg properly set, needed to... Riders coming, Wade mumbled, his head lolling against her shoulder. Lillian looked up to see a group of men on horseback approaching fast. Neighbors, she realized, drawn by the smoke. John Morrison was in the lead, his face grim. "We saw the fire," Morrison called as they drew close. "Is Wade hurt?" "His leg's broken and he's got a head injury," Lillian called back. "I need to get him home and send for the doctor." "We'll handle the fire," Morrison said. "You get him taken care of. Charlie, ride with them in case they need help." The ride back to the ranch passed in a blur. Charlie Morrison, John's youngest son, helped her get Wade inside and onto the bed, then rode for the doctor while Lillian tended to her husband. She cleaned the wound on his head, changed the makeshift splint for a proper one, and tried to keep him still despite his attempts to get up and check on the cattle. "The cattle are fine," she insisted, pressing him back down. "The men are handling the fire. You need to stay put before you make that leg worse." "But the damage, the loss." Wade's face was tight with pain and worry. "Is secondary to you being alive," Lillian finished firmly. "Everything else we can rebuild. I can't rebuild you." The doctor arrived at dusk, a gruff older man who examined Wade with practiced efficiency. The diagnosis was both better and worse than expected. A clean break that would heal properly if Wade stayed off it for at least 6 weeks. But the head injury was concerning enough that the doctor wanted him watched carefully for signs of concussion. "No working, no riding, no doing anything but resting," the doctor instructed, giving Lillian a pointed look. "I'm holding you responsible for keeping him in bed, Mrs. Vance." "I understand," Lillian said, already mentally cataloging everything that would need to be done to keep the ranch running with Wade incapacitated. Over the next few days, the full scope of the crisis became clear. The fire had consumed nearly a third of their best grazing land. Worse, the flames had been deliberately set. The territorial marshal found evidence of accelerant at the fire's origin point. Someone had tried to burn them out. The prime suspect was obvious. Robert Emerson, still bitter about losing the court case, striking back the only way he could. But without proof, there was nothing the marshal could do except promise to investigate. Lillian found herself running the ranch alone for the first time, with only Thomas's help and the occasional assistance of sympathetic neighbors. She rose before dawn and worked until well after dark, managing livestock and repairs and 100 other tasks she'd never had to handle on her own. Her hands developed new calluses, her muscles ached in places she didn't know existed, and exhaustion became her constant companion. But she refused to complain, refused to show weakness. This was her ranch too now, her livelihood, her future. If Wade couldn't protect it, then she would. It was during this time that the community's attitude began to shift. The women who'd gossiped about her saw her working in the fields, saw her handling cattle and mending fences with grim determination. The men who'd questioned her character saw her refuse help she couldn't repay, saw her pride and her competence. Slowly, grudgingly, respect began to replace suspicion. Margaret Cartwright was one of the first to capitulate. She arrived one afternoon with a basket of food, and an expression that suggested the words she was about to speak caused her physical pain. "I was wrong about you," she said stiffly, standing on the porch while Lillian regarded her with wary surprise. "I judged you based on circumstances rather than character. That was unfair." Lillian could have been gracious, could have accepted the apology with magnanimous forgiveness. But weeks of exhaustion and stress had worn her patience thin. "Yes, it was unfair," she agreed bluntly. "You used Sarah's memory as a weapon against me, and you tried to poison my marriage with lies. I appreciate the apology, Mrs. Cartwright, but forgiveness is going to take some time." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that what you're doing, keeping this ranch running while Wade recovers, it's impressive. Sarah would have—" She stopped, reconsidered. "You're a good rancher's wife, Mrs. Vance. Better than I gave you credit for." It was perhaps the best compliment Margaret Cartwright was capable of giving, and Lillian accepted it with a nod. After the woman left, she allowed herself a small smile. Progress, however grudging, was still progress. Wade healed slowly, frustrated by his immobility, but forced to acknowledge that pushing himself too soon would only set back his recovery. He directed operations from bed, telling Lillian what needed to be done and trusting her to execute his instructions. The enforced teamwork strengthened their partnership in unexpected ways. "You're a natural at this," Wade observed one evening, watching her review the cattle inventory. "Better than I was at your age." "I had a good teacher," Lillian replied, glancing up from the ledger with a smile. "Besides, I'm motivated. This ranch is mine too now. I have a stake in its success." "More than a stake," Wade said softly. "This is your legacy, Lillian. Yours and Thomas's and whatever children we might have. What we build here, it's for all of us." Children. The word still carried weight, still represented hope tinged with fear. They hadn't spoken much about it since the incident in town, both of them stepping carefully around the subject. "Wade," Lillian said hesitantly. "About that. About children. I've been thinking—" "You're not pregnant," Wade said, reading her expression. It wasn't a question. "No, and I'm starting to wonder if maybe—" She trailed off, unable to voice the fear that had been growing in her mind. What if she couldn't have children? What if Wade had married her expecting a family, and she couldn't give him one? "Then we'll deal with it," Wade said simply. "Together. Just like we've dealt with everything else. And if children don't come, we still have Thomas. We still have each other. That's more than enough." Lillian moved to the bed, sitting carefully on the edge so as not to jostle his injured leg. "You mean that?" "I mean it." Wade pulled her down for a kiss, gentle and reassuring. "I didn't marry you to be a broodmare, Lillian. I married you because I love you, because you're strong and brave and stubborn as hell, because you make me laugh and you challenge me and you've made this house feel like home again. Children would be a blessing, but they're not why I need you." The knot of anxiety in Lillian's chest loosened slightly. She settled against Wade's good side, careful of his injuries, and let herself simply be held. 6 weeks after the fire, Wade was finally cleared by the doctor to resume light work. The ranch had survived, battered but intact, thanks largely to Lillian's tireless efforts. The neighbors who'd helped fight the fire and assist with the heaviest work had seen her character firsthand, and word had spread. By the time Wade was back on his feet, the gossip about the Vances had died down to occasional whispers, easily ignored. Robert Emerson had disappeared from the territory, the marshal's investigation making it clear he was the prime suspect in the arson. Whether he'd fled to avoid prosecution or simply given up on controlling Lillian's life, they didn't know and didn't particularly care. He was gone, and good riddance. The first day Wade could walk without crutches, he insisted on touring the property despite Lillian's protests. They walked the fence lines together, Wade leaning on her more than he wanted to admit, surveying the damage and planning repairs. "We'll reseed the burned pasture come spring," Wade said, squinting at the blackened earth. "It'll take a few years to fully recover, but it will. Land's resilient that way." "So are people," Lillian observed, thinking of everything they'd weathered, the trial, the gossip, the fire, Wade's injury. Each crisis had felt insurmountable at the time, but they'd survived them all. Wade stopped walking, turning to face her. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone serious enough to make Lillian's heart skip, "about what you said before, about this being your legacy too. And I realize there's something I need to do." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded document. "This is the deed to the ranch. I had it revised while I was laid up. It's in both our names now, Lillian. Equal partners in everything." Lillian stared at the paper, her hands trembling as she took it. Equal partners, not just in practice, but in law, in writing, in undeniable fact. "Wade, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep fighting for this place the way you fought for us," Wade replied. "Say you'll build this legacy with me, for us and for Thomas and for whatever future we create together." "Yes," Lillian whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes to all of it." They stood there on the scorched earth of their north pasture, the Montana wind whipping around them, holding each other while the sun set in spectacular fashion across the western peaks. They'd been tested by fire, literal and figurative, and they'd emerged stronger. The orphan girl who'd stumbled into this yard desperate and starving was gone. In her place stood Lillian Vance, co-owner of a thriving ranch, wife to a good man, mother to a wonderful boy. She'd earned every inch of the life she'd built, paid for it with sweat and tears and unwavering determination. And she was just getting started, The years that followed brought a prosperity neither of them had dared to hope for. The burned pasture recovered slowly but surely, new grass pushing through the blackened earth like a promise kept. Lillian's preserves and baked goods became sought after throughout the territory, her reputation for quality spreading far beyond Silver Creek. She established a small but profitable side business, selling her wares to hotels and restaurants as far as Helena, the income providing a cushion against the unpredictable nature of ranching. Wade expanded the cattle operation carefully, investing profits back into the land and livestock. By the time Thomas turned 12, the Vance Ranch was one of the most successful in the region, known for both the quality of its beef and the integrity of its owners. The whispers that had once followed them through town had transformed into respectful greetings, grudging admiration, and eventually genuine friendship from neighbors who'd learned to see past their own prejudices. But it was the small moments that mattered most to Lillian. The quiet evenings on the porch with Wade, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The sound of Thomas's laughter as he worked alongside his father, learning to be a man through example rather than lecture. The way Wade still brought her wildflowers in summer, never saying where they came from, but she knew he rode out early to pick them before the day's work began. Marriage, she'd discovered, wasn't the fairy tale ending she'd read about in the worn books at the orphanage. It was harder than that, more complicated, filled with mundane frustrations and occasional sharp disagreements. Wade left his boots in the middle of the floor. Lillian had a tendency to reorganize his tools without asking. They argued about money, about Thomas's education, about whether to buy more land or improve what they had. But underneath the ordinary conflicts ran a current of love so deep and steady that it sustained them through everything. They'd built their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and shared hardship, and that foundation proved unshakable. It was on a crisp October morning in their 5th year of marriage that Wade came to find Lillian in the garden, where she was harvesting the last of the season's vegetables before the first hard freeze. His expression was both nervous and excited in a way she hadn't seen since the day he'd proposed. "Leave that for now," he said, extending his hand. "There's something I want to show you." Lillian brushed dirt from her hands, intrigued. "What is it?" "You'll see. Come on." He led her to the barn where he'd saddled both horses. They rode out together, heading west toward a section of land that bordered their property. A beautiful piece of rangeland with a creek running through it, and a view of the mountains that took her breath away every time she saw it. "The Henderson place," Lillian said, recognizing the landmarks. "Wade, what are we doing here? This isn't our land." "It could be." Wade dismounted, helping her down. "Old man Henderson's selling. He wants to move to California to be near his daughter. He offered it to me first before putting it up for general sale." Lillian looked around, her mind already calculating the possibilities. The land was prime grazing territory, well-watered and sheltered from the worst of winter's winds. Adding it to their ranch would nearly double their holdings. "Can we afford it?" she asked practically. "Just barely. We'd have to use most of our savings, and it would be tight for a year or two." Wade moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. "But I think we could make it work. I wanted your opinion before I made any decisions. This is your ranch too, Lillian. Your future. I won't buy land you don't want." The fact that he asked, that he treated her as an equal partner in every decision, still moved her even after 5 years. She studied the land with a critical eye, weighing risk against potential. "We'd need to hire more hands," she mused. "Couldn't manage this much territory with just the two of us and Thomas." "Already thought of that. Morrison's youngest son is looking for steady work. Good kid, knows cattle." "And the house?" Lillian pointed to the small cabin visible in the distance. "It's practically falling down. We couldn't live there." "Don't need to live there. Could use it for storage, or fix it up for the hired hand." Wade squeezed her hand. "What do you think? Is it worth the risk?" Lillian was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over in her mind. 5 years ago, she'd had nothing. No home, no family, no future beyond the next desperate day. Now Wade was asking her opinion on a land purchase that would cost more money than she'd ever imagined possessing. The transformation was dizzying. "I think," she said slowly, "that we didn't come this far by playing it safe. I think we take the risk. We buy the land." Wade's grin was brilliant. He swept her up in a kiss that left them both breathless, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "We're going to need a bigger operation," he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "More cattle, more hands, more of everything. It's going to be hard work." "When has that ever stopped us?" Lillian challenged, her eyes sparkling. They bought the Henderson place that week, signing papers in the same courthouse where they'd once defended their marriage. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Thomas was beside himself with excitement, already planning where he'd build corrals and how many horses they could raise on the new land. The expansion brought new challenges: training hired hands, managing a larger herd, coordinating work across two properties. It stretched them thin. But Lillian had learned to thrive under pressure. She managed the household in her preserves business while also overseeing the books for the ranch, her sharp mind for numbers proving invaluable as their operation grew. It was during this busy time that she finally allowed herself to hope again about children. 5 years of marriage with no pregnancy had led her to believe it simply wasn't meant to be. And she'd made peace with that. Thomas was enough. Their life was full and rich without adding more to it. So when the familiar symptoms began in late spring, the nausea, the fatigue, the strange food aversions, she almost dismissed them as illness. It was Wade who suggested she see the doctor, worried when she couldn't keep breakfast down for 3 days running. The doctor's examination was brief, his conclusion delivered with a knowing smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Vance. You're about 3 months along, I'd say. Baby should arrive around Christmas." Lillian sat frozen in the examining chair, unable to process the words. Pregnant. After 5 years of nothing, of accepting that it wouldn't happen, suddenly it had. "Are you certain?" she managed. "Quite certain. You're healthy. The baby seems to be developing normally. Just take it easy, eat well, and you should be fine." The doctor patted her shoulder. "Your husband will be pleased, I imagine." Pleased. Wade would be... What would Wade be? They'd stopped talking about children years ago, both of them content with what they had. Would he be happy? Worried? Overwhelmed at the thought of starting over with an infant when Thomas was nearly grown? She rode home in a daze, her hand unconsciously resting on her still flat stomach. A baby. Their baby. The child she'd stopped believing would ever exist was growing inside her, real and undeniable. Wade was in the barn when she arrived, working on a saddle repair. He looked up as she entered, his smile fading when he saw her expression. "What did the doctor say? Are you sick? Is it serious?" "I'm pregnant," Lillian blurted out, unable to think of a gentler way to deliver the news. Wade's hand stilled on the leather. For a long moment he just stared at her, his face unreadable. Then he crossed the space between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Say that again," he whispered against her hair. "I'm pregnant. 3 months. The baby will come at Christmas." Wade pulled back far enough to see her face, and she saw tears glistening in his eyes. "We're having a baby." "We're having a baby," Lillian confirmed, her own tears starting to fall. "Are you happy? I know we stopped talking about it, and I wasn't sure if you still wanted—" "Happy?" Wade laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and disbelief. "Lillian, I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. Another child. Our child." He pressed his hand to her stomach reverently. "You've given me everything. Everything I thought I'd lost forever." The pregnancy progressed normally despite Lillian's initial fears. She continued working as long as she could, only slowing down in the final months when her expanding belly made mounting a horse impractical. Wade became almost comically protective, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a biscuit pan and hovering whenever she climbed stairs. Thomas was excited about becoming a big brother, though also clearly nervous about what it would mean for his place in the family. "Will you still have time for me?" he asked one evening, watching Lillian knit tiny socks by the fire. "When the baby comes?" "Of course," Lillian assured him, setting aside her knitting to give him her full attention. "You're my son, Thomas. That doesn't change because there's a new baby. If anything, we'll need you more. Babies require a lot of help, and we're counting on you to be the best big brother in Montana." "I'll teach them to ride," Thomas decided, warming to the idea, "and rope. And I'll make sure nobody picks on them at school." "I have no doubt you'll be wonderful," Lillian said, pulling him close for a hug that was made awkward by her belly, but no less heartfelt. The baby arrived on a snowy December night, 2 weeks before Christmas. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Lillian was certain she wouldn't survive it. But the midwife was skilled, Wade was steadfast at her side, and just before dawn, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that proclaimed her determination to be heard. "A girl," the midwife announced, cleaning the infant and wrapping her in a soft blanket. "Healthy lungs, all fingers and toes accounted for. You've got a fighter here, Mrs. Vance." Wade took his daughter with shaking hands, staring down at her tiny face with an expression of pure wonder. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Lillian, she's absolutely perfect." Lillian, exhausted but exhilarated, watched her husband cradle their daughter and felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it. They'd survived so much to get to this moment: poverty and prejudice, fire and injury, doubt and fear. And now here they were, a family made whole by this tiny new life. "What should we name her?" Wade asked, carefully placing the baby in Lillian's arms. Lillian looked down at her daughter, their daughter, studying the delicate features, the dark hair that matched Wade's, the determined set of her small jaw that reminded Lillian of her own stubbornness. "Hope," she said softly. "Let's call her Hope, because that's what she represents. Hope for the future. Hope that even when things seem impossible, good things can still happen." "Hope Vance," Wade repeated, testing the name. "I like it. It's perfect." Thomas was allowed in to meet his sister an hour later, creeping into the room with exaggerated care, as if afraid he might break something. When he saw the baby in Lillian's arms, his eyes went wide with amazement. "She's so small," he breathed. "Was I ever that small?" "Even smaller," Wade told him. "You were a scrawny little thing." "Can I hold her?" Lillian glanced at Wade, who nodded. Together, they helped Thomas settle into a chair and carefully transferred Hope into his arms. The boy held his sister like she was made of spun glass, his young face serious with the weight of responsibility. "Hi, Hope," he whispered. "I'm your big brother, Thomas. I'm going to teach you all kinds of things, and I'll always keep you safe. I promise." Watching them together, her husband, her son, her daughter, Lillian felt a sense of peace settle over her that she'd never known before. This was what she'd been fighting for all along, even when she didn't know it. Not just survival, not just security, but this, a family built on love and choice and unwavering commitment. The first years of Hope's life were chaotic in the best possible way. The baby proved to be exactly as stubborn as Lillian had suspected, refusing to sleep through the night until she was nearly a year old and demanding attention with the imperious confidence of someone who knew she was adored. Thomas took his role as big brother seriously, entertaining Hope with silly faces and songs when Lillian needed a break, teaching her to recognize animal sounds before she could properly talk. The ranch continued to prosper. With the expanded land and larger herd, they were able to weather the occasional bad year without catastrophic losses. Lillian's preserves business grew to the point where she hired 2 local women to help with production, providing much-needed income to their families while freeing her to focus on Hope and the ranch management. By the time Hope turned 4, she was a miniature force of nature, trailing after Thomas and Wade with single-minded determination despite her short legs. She wanted to do everything they did, and her furious tears when told she was too small were legendary throughout the county. "She's just like you," Wade told Lillian one evening, watching their daughter practice roping a fence post with a piece of string. "Stubborn, fearless, refuses to accept limitations." "Poor thing," Lillian said with mock sympathy, "having to inherit my worst qualities." "Your best qualities," Wade corrected, pulling her close. "The ones that saved your life, the ones that saved mine, too, in a different way." It was true, Lillian reflected. Wade had been surviving before she came, but not truly living. The ranch had been functional but joyless. Thomas was cared for but lacking a mother's touch. And Wade himself had been going through the motions of existence without really engaging with life. She'd brought light back into the darkness, not through any grand gesture, but simply by being herself, stubborn and determined and refusing to give up. And in return, Wade had given her everything she'd never known she could have: a home, a family, a future that extended beyond mere survival into genuine happiness. The 5th anniversary of Hope's birth and their 10th wedding anniversary fell on the same December week. Wade had been secretive for days, disappearing into town on mysterious errands and refusing to tell Lillian what he was planning. Thomas was in on whatever it was. She could tell from his barely suppressed excitement, but he wouldn't crack under her interrogation either. On the morning of their anniversary, Wade woke her before dawn, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Get dressed," he whispered. "Something warm. I have a surprise for you." "Wade Vance, what have you done?" Lillian asked, but she was already reaching for her clothes. "You'll see. Come on." They rode out together in the pre-dawn darkness, heading west toward the Henderson property, their property now, though Lillian still sometimes thought of it by its old name. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the eastern horizon in shades of pink and gold. Wade led her to a rise overlooking both sections of their land, where someone had built a small platform and set up 2 chairs. As they dismounted and climbed the platform, the sun broke free of the mountains, illuminating the full scope of what they'd built together. From this vantage point, Lillian could see it all. The original ranch house where she'd first arrived, desperate and starving, the expanded barns and corrals, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the fertile fields she'd planted and tended. Beyond that, the Henderson property stretched toward the western mountains, a testament to their willingness to take risks and work hard for what they wanted. 10 years ago today, I married a girl who had nothing but the clothes on her back and more courage than anyone I'd ever met, Wade said quietly, taking her hand. I thought I was doing her a favor, giving her a job and a place to live. I was too stupid to realize she was the one doing me the favor. She brought my house back to life. She gave my son a mother. She made me remember how to feel something other than grief. Wade. Lillian's voice caught. Let me finish. Wade squeezed her hand. You've been my equal partner in every way that matters. You've worked as hard as I have to build this place. You've earned every inch of this land through sweat and determination and refusing to quit even when things got hard. And I wanted to make sure that was recognized legally and completely. He pulled a document from his coat pocket, unfolding it carefully. This is the updated deed to both properties. I had it revised. Everything. The original ranch, the Henderson place, all the livestock and equipment and accounts. It's in both our names now, 50-50 ownership, equal partners in every sense of the word. Lillian took the document with shaking hands, scanning the legal language until she found their names. Wade Vance and Lillian Vance, joint owners. Not his property that she managed, not his ranch where she worked. Their ranch, their legacy, their future. You did this for our anniversary? She asked through tears. I did it because it's right, because you've earned it 1,000 times over, because I want you to know, legally and officially, that everything we've built is as much yours as mine. Wade cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. You're not the orphan girl I took in out of pity, Lillian. You're my wife, my partner, my equal, and I love you more now than I did the day we married. I love you too, Lillian whispered. I love you and Thomas and Hope and this life we've built. I love that you've never made me feel less than, never treated me as anything but an equal, even when the world said I wasn't. You gave me more than a home, Wade. You gave me a place to belong. They sat together on the platform as the sun rose higher, watching their ranch come to life below. Smoke began to rise from the house chimney, Thomas making breakfast, probably burning the bacon but trying his best. In the distance, Hope's voice carried on the morning air, calling for her papa and mama with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. We should get back, Wade said eventually, before Thomas burns down the kitchen. In a minute, Lillian leaned her head on his shoulder, wanting to hold on to this moment just a little longer. I want to remember this. The view, the sunrise, the feeling of everything being exactly right. It is exactly right, Wade agreed. Took us a while to get here. Hell, we nearly didn't make it a few times. But we did it. We built something real, something that'll last. They rode back to the house hand in hand, the deed safely tucked in Lillian's pocket. Thomas had indeed burned the bacon, and Hope had somehow gotten into the flour bin and was covered head to toe in white powder. The kitchen was chaos, but it was their chaos, and Lillian wouldn't have changed a single thing about it. Over breakfast, slightly burnt bacon, passable eggs, and biscuits Lillian quickly whipped up, Thomas made an announcement. "I've been thinking," he said with the seriousness of a 16-year-old trying to sound adult, "about my future, and I want to stay here, not go to university like some of the other fellows are planning. I want to learn to run this ranch properly, so when you two are old and retired, it'll be in good hands." Wade and Lillian exchanged glances across the table. They'd talked about Thomas's future often, debating whether to encourage him toward higher education or support his obvious love for ranching. "You're sure?" Wade asked. "Education opens doors, son. You could be anything you want." "I know," Thomas said, "but what I want is to be a rancher, like you, like Mama. I want to build on what you've started, expand it, pass it down to Hope, and maybe my own kids someday. This place, it's in my blood." Lillian felt tears prick her eyes again. The orphanage child who'd thought she'd never have a family now had a son who claimed this ranch as his heritage, who saw himself as part of a legacy worth preserving. The transformation was almost too much to comprehend. "Then that's what you'll do," Wade said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll start training you properly. Not just the day-to-day work, but the business side too, the accounts, the planning, the decision-making. By the time you're 21, you'll be running half this operation yourself. And when you're ready to marry," Lillian added, "we'll help you build a house on the property. Start your own family here, alongside ours. There's plenty of land for everyone." Hope, who'd been mostly focused on her eggs until now, looked up with determination in her eyes. "I want to be a rancher too," she announced. "Not just Thomas." "You absolutely can be," Lillian assured her. "Girls can be ranchers just as well as boys. I'm proof of that." "You're proof of a lot of things," Wade said quietly, his eyes meeting Lillian's across the table. "Proof that second chances are real. Proof that love can grow in the most unlikely places. Proof that where you start doesn't determine where you end up." The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Summer heat gave way to autumn colors, which surrendered to winter snow, which melted into spring renewal. The ranch thrived under their joint management, expanding gradually as opportunities arose. Thomas grew into a capable young man, taking on more responsibility until he truly was Wade's equal partner in running the cattle operation. Hope grew wild and free, learning to ride almost before she could walk properly, developing the same fierce independence that had characterized her mother. Lillian's hair began to show streaks of silver at her temples. Wade's hands grew more gnarled with arthritis, though he refused to slow down. They were growing old together, their bodies marking the passage of time, even as their love deepened into something richer and more complex than youthful passion. On a summer evening when Hope was 15 and Thomas had just turned 26 with a wife of his own and a baby on the way, the whole family gathered on the porch of the original house. 3 generations of Vances, bound together by blood and choice, an unwavering commitment to each other, and the land they called home. "Tell us the story again, Mama," Hope demanded, curled up next to Lillian on the porch swing. "About how you and Papa met." It was a story they'd heard dozens of times, but they never seemed to tire of it. Lillian looked at Wade, who smiled and nodded for her to begin. "I was 18 years old," Lillian started, her voice taking on the cadence of a familiar tale. "And I'd lost everything. The orphanage burned down, and I had nowhere to go and no one who wanted me. I walked for 3 days with nothing but determination keeping me upright. And when I got to this ranch, I was so desperate and so terrified that all I could do was beg for work." "And Papa gave you a chance," Hope prompted, knowing her part in the telling. "He did, when no one else would. He saw something in me worth saving, even when I wasn't sure I was worth it myself. He gave me work and dignity and eventually love," Thomas finished, grinning. "Stop being shy about it, Mama. You two were obviously meant to be." "Nothing about it was obvious at the time," Wade interjected, his hand finding Lillian's in the gathering darkness. "I was a widower with a son and a heart I thought was too broken to ever work properly again. She was a girl who'd been given every reason to be bitter and defeated but refused to be either. We found each other when we both needed finding. And you built all this," Hope said, gesturing at the ranch spread out before them. "From nothing." "Not from nothing," Lillian corrected gently. "From hope and hard work and refusing to give up even when everything seemed impossible. Those are powerful things. They can build kingdoms out of ashes. The conversation drifted to other topics. Thomas's plans for the next cattle drive, Hope's desire to start breeding horses, the upcoming county fair where Lillian's preserves would compete yet again. But under it all ran the steady current of family, of belonging, of home in the deepest sense of the word. Later, when the younger generation had dispersed to their various beds and pursuits, Lillian and Wade remained on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. "Do you ever think about that girl who showed up here?" Wade asked quietly. "So skinny I thought she'd blow away in a strong wind, so scared but trying so hard to hide it." "Sometimes," Lillian admitted, "though she feels like a different person now. Someone I used to be but can barely remember being." "She'd be proud of you," Wade said, "of everything you became, everything you built." "We built," Lillian corrected, the same way she always did when Wade tried to give her too much credit. "I didn't do any of this alone." "No, you didn't. We did it together, and that's exactly how it should be." Wade stood, offering his hand. "Come on, Mrs. Vance, let's go to bed. Tomorrow's going to be another long day." Lillian took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. 44 years old now, she still felt echoes of that frightened 18-year-old sometimes. Still woke from occasional nightmares where she was back on that road with nowhere to go and no one who cared. But those moments were fleeting, easily banished by the solid reality of her life. The land under her feet, the family around her, the love that had sustained her through everything. They walked into the house together, past the kitchen where she'd first eaten a decent meal in days, past the room where she'd slept that first night, hardly daring to hope for a future beyond the next morning. The house had been expanded over the years, additional rooms added as their family grew, but these original spaces remained the heart of it all. In their bedroom, Lillian paused at the window, looking out over the moonlit ranch. Somewhere out there, cattle grazed peacefully. Somewhere out there, horses dozed in their corrals. Somewhere out there, the land stretched endlessly toward mountains that stood as eternal witnesses to all that had transpired here. A desperate girl had arrived with nothing. A woman had been forged in the fire of hardship and emerged stronger for it. A family had been built from the ruins of loss and the courage of second chances. A legacy had been established that would endure for generations. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better, something real and hard-won and infinitely more valuable for having been earned rather than given. "Come to bed, Lillian," Wade called softly from where he was already settling under the quilts. "Coming," she replied, turning away from the window and toward the man who'd given her everything by giving her a chance to prove what she could become. As she slipped into bed beside him, Wade's arms came around her with the comfortable ease of long practice. They'd shared this bed for 15 years now, through sickness and health, joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat. And if there were more silver in their hair and more lines on their faces than there'd been when they started, well, that was simply the price of living fully rather than merely surviving. "I love you," Lillian whispered into the darkness, the way she did every night. "I love you too," Wade replied the way he always did. Now and always. And in the safety of that love, in the security of the home they'd built, and the life they'd forged from impossible circumstances, Lillian Vance slept peacefully, dreaming of tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that, each one a gift, each one an opportunity to keep building the legacy they'd started with nothing but hope and determination. The orphan girl was long gone. In her place was a woman who'd proven that endings could become beginnings, that loss could transform into gain, and that the hardest journeys often led to the most beautiful destinations. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she was always meant to be. And that, after everything, was more than enough. It was everything.